Greetings, students. What we're going to look at to begin with is graphing equations. We're going to make tables of values. So the equations we're going to do are going to have a variable x and a variable y in it. So if it's already solved for y, then here's kind of what you want to do. All right, what we're going to do is we're going to choose some values for x. So I'm going to make a table. I'm going to call this column is the x values, that column's y value. So we're going to start by just choosing x values. And really on this, the logical way to do this is to do negative numbers, 0, and some positive numbers. Okay? I'm recording this outside. I hope you can hear the birds tweeting. All right. So here's what we're going to do next here is we're just going to do y equals x squared. So we do negative 2 to the second. We're going to work negative 1 to the second out. 0 to the second, 1 to the second, and 2 to the second, okay? Just basic algebra here. If you multiply a negative number by itself, you get a positive. So that's positive 4. This one is negative 1. You can certainly do all this in your head. This is 0 times 0, so that's 0. And then finally this, 1 times 1 is going to be 1. And 2 times 2 is going to be 4. Okay, so once you do that and make your table, then you want to plot your points. Okay, and this will give you what your graph basically looks like then. Okay, so I'm going to go left 2, up 4 for my first point, left 1, up 1 for the second point, 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 4. Okay, now you always want to connect the dots because there's an infinite number of points on this. It's not sufficient to just put your points. You have to sketch the shape. That shape goes on forever. So that's why I put the double arrows like that. All right, so that's what the graph of that looks like. We have a name for this. This is the graph of what we call a parabola. Next time you drink at a water fountain, and turn on the water fountain, it'll travel in a parabola. Okay. All right. Now this next one is the same idea, except it's not solved for y. So in this case, I'm going to recommend that we do something a little bit different on this. We're going to make a column for x. We're going to make a column for y on this then. Okay. Now what I'm going to do on this is I'm going to choose some numbers I know square roots of. Okay, so one way to do this, the way that you change that y, a y squared into a y, is you do the square root of both sides. Okay? Anytime you do the square root of both sides of an equation, you get a plus minus, and the square root of y squared is y. Okay, let me kind of go to the side and explain that because most people don't have all that good of a background for this. If you had this equation right here, there's two answers to this equation. One of those answers is 2, because 2 to the second is 4. The other answer of this equation is negative 2, because negative 2 to the second is 4. Okay? That's why we have that plus or minus. It gives us those two answers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose numbers that I know square roots of. All right, so I know like the square root of 0. And when you're dealing with square roots, you can't do a square root of a negative number. Okay, it doesn't make any sense to do the square root of negative 4, okay, because there's not a number you would multiply by itself that would give you negative 4. Such another number doesn't exist. Another number we know a square root of is 1. We know the square root of 4, and we know the square root of 9. Okay, and this is just one way to do this problem. So what I do is I do this. I do plus minus the square root of 0. The square root of 0 is just 0. So your first point is 0, 0. Then we plug in 1, so we'd have plus minus square root of 1. Okay, the square root of 1 is 1 because 1 times 1 is 1. And there's two answers. There's a negative 1 and there's a 1. And then we proceed the same way. You plug in square root of 4. The square root of 4 is 2. There's two answers. Okay, there's a negative 2 and there's a positive 2. And the last thing is the 9, so if we do square root of 9, we get 3. Well, there's two answers. There's a plus and there's a minus 3. Okay, like that. All right, so that's one way you can do that. I'll show you another way to reason this out in just a minute. Now, if we plot the points, well, we have 0, 0, so we start there. Now, see, this is giving you 2 points, 1, -1, and 1, 1. Okay, so if you go over 1, down 1, that's the point 1, -1. If you go over 1, up 1, that's the point 1, 1. So it's going to go like that. Okay, and then same thing here. There's 2 points. There's 4, -2, and there's 4, 2. So if you go over 4, down 2, that gives you the point 4, -2. If you go over 4, up 2, that gives the point 4, 2, and so forth. And then by the same logic, you go over 9, up 3, and you go over 9 and down 3. Okay, so this graph looks like this. It's a parabola, but it's going sideways. Okay, so that's how the graph of that goes, is like that. Now, if you didn't know to do that square root, and I think a lot of students wouldn't know to do that, you know, your only choice on this would really just be if you chose values for x. Sometimes you would have to know that there's 2 answers. So in other words, if you have x equals y squared and you let x equal 4, you would get this equation. There's 2 answers. Okay, it's either 2 to the second or it's -2 to the second. That's why we get these 2 points. That's why we get 4, 2 and 4, -2. So that's kind of the wise way to do that problem, is to take square root of both sides. Okay, and this is giving you a picture of all the solutions of that equation. So one thing that you'll learn is if the square is on the x, so if you have like x squared, then the parabola goes up, or it can go down if you had like a -x squared. If the square is on the y, then it goes like this. It's going to orient itself a little bit differently. So that's kind of how that goes. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of take you through 2 problems here. I'm going to tell you what to use on this. So before you do this yourself, what I want you to do is we're going to have an XY table. And I'm going to have you use on this -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2. And then you're going to plug in to y equals x to the third, then graph. And on the next page, let me show you what I want you to do here. Okay, I'm going to give you, and see if you can figure this out. Okay, we're going to say x and y. So what I'm going to say on this is I'm going to say 0. I'm going to have you use 0. Or let's do this kind of like this. I'm going to tell you what to do on this. I'm going to tell you to do, let's see, -1, -8, 0, 1, and 8. And I'll explain why I'm giving you those numbers in a few minutes. So go ahead and pause the video right now and see if you can do those 2 problems. Okay, then come back and check. All right, so let's see. Go ahead and check and see if you got this right. Now, this one, once you get a little bit better knowledge of what certain graphs look like, then you get a little bit better idea of what to use for x. All right, so generally, it's most of the time it's a good idea to use these numbers for x. So the key thing I wanted to make sure that you did right is you do -2 to the third. You're multiplying 3 negatives, so you get a negative. Okay. And then -1 to the third, again, you're multiplying 3 negatives, so you get -1. 0 to the third is 3 zeros multiplied, and so forth. So you have to work this out to get those numbers correct, right? And that's just a matter of plotting the points. So you got -2, -8 is left 2, down 8, -1, -1, and so forth. Okay, so that's how that graph goes. The key thing is just getting that, doing the arithmetic and plotting the points correctly. Okay, so pause if you need to. Otherwise, I'm going to move next page. Okay, this one looks kind of like it's sideways. It's a little different than the last one. So again, I told you all to use these numbers, and I'll explain why I knew to use these numbers in just a minute. So if you plugged in -8, you would end up having the equation -8 equals y the third. Well, what you're thinking of is what number do you multiply out 3 times that would give you -8? That number is -2. So you kind of can work backwards and figure that out in your head. Then if you plug -1 in, you get -1 equals y the third. So again, you're thinking of what number do I multiply out 3 times that gives -1? That number is -1. Okay, so that's how you can do that. You can kind of do that, work backwards in your head. The next one you would say 0 is y the third. So the number that you multiply out 3 times to give 0 is a 0, and so forth. Okay, and then this one's 1, and that's 2. And then if you plot the points, left 8 down 2, left 1 down 1, and so forth, that's what your graph looks like. Okay, so that is all I'm going to do on this very short video, is just want you to know how to make a table of values to graph various functions. Okay.